Welcome to the WithIngram series of podcasts. I'm Philip Ingram. This is episode 8, and today I'm talking to Andy Jaquith with QOMPLX. Warning, you might actually learn something. Andy, welcome to the WithIngram series of podcasts. Can you, for the listeners that I have out there, introduce yourself, introduce QOMPLX, your company, and just say where you're sitting at the minute, because I think we're talking over several thousand miles.
Sure. So hi, everybody. So I'm Andy Jaquith. I'm the Chief Security Officer of QOMPLX. I'm also the General Manager of the Cyber Business Unit. So my background is I've spent a significant amount of time in information security, what we now call cyber, somewhat of a quaint term. I probably would have wrinkled my nose at it 20 years ago, but here we are, and been working with clients in different industries for a bit. My most recent tour prior to coming back into the vendor space was as a managing director at JPMorgan Chase, where I was the global cyber risk officer in the second line of defense. And before that, I was the managing director at Goldman Sachs, running the tech risk measurement and analytics program. So been pretty steeped in data. That's been a staple of my career. I'm probably known, if I have a thing I'm known for in the space, it is two things. I'm probably one of the guys that most people think of when they think of security metrics. And the other is I suppose I claim in having invented the term the hamster wheel of pain to describe the patch scan and repeat cycle that many CISOs tend to find themselves in. So that's probably the easiest introduction to myself.
I love this idea of the hamster wheel of pain. Go on. There are people out there, because a lot of the listeners are not necessarily cyber or CISO experts. I hit a wider security audience. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what is your hamster wheel of pain?
So I observed, this is probably circa 2005 or thereabouts, so quite a while ago, that much of what passed for security in the space was where you'd hire a bunch of consultants, they'd take a bunch of cybersecurity scanners, aim it in your infrastructure, and they'd come up with an enumerated list of horrible findings. And you would then, as a CISO, you would be obligated to go ahead and take a look at them, triage them in terms of risk, high, medium, and low, send them out to various teams, whether they work for you or not, have them fix them, and then at a later point, do the exercise all over again. It's a little bit like the back of the laundry bottles. It says, lather, rinse, repeat. The only difference is you're never getting clean. And so, this seemed like a relatively unsatisfactory place to be. So the space where I probably made a bit of a mark from a reputation standpoint was saying life has got to be better than this. And surely there are ways, if in security you're either doing the hamster wheel of pain and serially enumerating and whacking moles, basically, then clearly there's other things you could be doing. And that means, like, what is the business of the CISO? What activities do they do? How do they actually reduce risk? What controls are they implementing? How do you try and instrument those to get a better sense of whether those activities you're expecting to do are genuinely resulting in reduced risk at the end of the day? So that's probably the hamster wheel of pain. Was initially a point of irritation, but rather like pearls, the grains of sand trapped in an oyster, it eventually yielded a pearl in the form of a book, which has been I've been gratified has funded a vacation or two. So it worked out.
Yeah, one of the big cries that there is around the wider security piece at the minute is the convergence between cyber and physical world. As more and more physical devices become IP enabled and working through. And I'll expand that a little further. My background is a former intelligence officer. If I want to hack into a network, I'll hack a person who's got access.
Yeah.
And any bits of software you've got sitting on your network is not going to sniff the fact that person is accessing what I want. How do you deal with that?
Hard problem. Internet of Things is one of these areas where you can take the law of large numbers and you can throw your hand up and say billions and billions of these things. What do we do? And feel helpless and lost. Or you can also look at it from the standpoint of, like, what's your sphere of control? What can you do personally, either as a consumer or an individual or in an enterprise? How do you do it? And certainly, most of what I think is a test of fitness for most security officers is, what's your inventory? Do you know what's actually on your network? It's actually quite hard to do to keep a clean network and to keep only the things that you know about on them and the things you don't know about off them. But some companies do it. Others, it's quite hard. If you've got staff that are temporary and you've got a lot of devices popping in and out of your network, That's quite hard. I was years ago. One of my clients was a broadcast network, and we went on site to talk to them. And I have this I have this sort of mental metric around IP address space turnover.
Mm-hmm.
So of all the devices, the DHCP leases that when all the devices obtain an IP address, how many are there uniquely on your network over the course of a day? And how fast does it turn over? Almost like an inventory measure, right? And so I asked that sort of stock question to the guy, and he said, "Well, our address space probably turns over once a day." And I said, "Well, that's amazing. How does that happen?" And he said, "Well, we've got a lot of contractors and crew that are coming in that don't work for us, and they're bringing their own devices and own gear and everything else. And they're all hardware and stuff." So I think if you can do something about this in an enterprise space, you should. And I think if you can't, then you can't. But increasingly, what we do see is ephemeral devices popping up, particularly in the cloud space. And so what you really need to do is you need to, it's not so much that you have a control over your inventory, but you have control over the images that you make things and the configurations. So if you can establish that a device looks like one of yours, it's descended from an image that you know and can manage and control, and that it hasn't drifted from the config that you think is good, then it almost doesn't matter what the device is. So that's kind of the approach that I think some people are taking these days as we move to more dynamic inventory. And I think this is just a fact of life as we move ahead.
Do you think there's a wider societal issue here when it comes to understanding what the cyber threat is? People know what to do behind closed doors. They know when to close the curtains in their houses. They know what not to do in public. But when it comes to it being on a device of some description, people seem to forget all the basic rules that you'd apply in the physical world. And is there something that we should be doing, at the very outset in our education schools at the earliest age to try and generate or get a generation of people who actually understand what their cyber exposure is, what the cyber threat is, and can then move that into the workspace as they're going?
Yeah, I think so. I was my last employer in the banking space had a wonderful guy on staff as part of the wealth management part of the bank, and he was a fantastic security evangelist, a fellow named Gary. And he would basically just sort of say, "How many of you have an iPhone?" And everybody would take out their iPhones, and you'd wave it around, and he'd say, and he'd then start enumerating all the things, all the digital exhaust that this device was emitting
Yes, exactly.
that could be taken advantage of, and what you ought to be doing. For example, if you've got Face ID in your phone, by default, things like your train tickets and things like that will just pop up on screen when you look at it, right? And so, he had some very practical advice, and I would encourage everybody to become more aware of some of these common sense steps. But most people aren't going to do it. And so, you really leave this down to the manufacturers on how to increase defaults that are carefully balancing security and usability. And sometimes they get it right, and sometimes they don't. Some of the routers, like the Linksys routers and all these other things, got it fairly disastrously wrong in the mid 2000s, and you started to see like this spate of infections of botnets infecting home routers and things like that. You like to think some of this stuff's getting better, but device manufacturers tend to be idiots about this stuff. So I think as a species, as a voting block, as it were, security managers, big companies, we need to continue to just turn the screws on the manufacturers so that we have better defaults. I think that's really the key to a lot of this. And then, I think certainly the incremental user education should help. Some of the usability stuff like you're seeing in the FIDO world, like the increased emergence of fingerprint readers and USB, USB security keys and things like that. Those are all net additive. They're still not mainstream enough for somebody like my 82-year-old dad to take advantage of. But we need to keep pushing so that we've got just better defaults. You don't have to work so hard, and yet you have better security. I think that's the key to it all.
But when it comes to the economic piece and looking at the mass produced IoT devices out of China, the more cost-effective 5G components from the likes of Huawei and elsewhere, that the debate's going on in the UK and elsewhere across the world that comes in, versus trying to get something from another manufacturer who just happens to be using chipsets from the threat countries and stuff anyway. Do you think there's too much hype around the wider threat that's out there, and a lack of understanding that in reality, if you're going to put anything onto the net somewhere, if someone really wants to get at it, they will do?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I've seen some examples of this up close. I think most of you, most of your listeners will probably be familiar with the Bloomberg story from a year and change ago about an alleged hardware implant on these Supermicro server boards, right?
Yeah.
And the institution I was at the time, we had some internal introspection. Is probably the best way I can say it without getting into too much detail about what level of threat that actually represented. And
Yeah.
I'll give you my own personal view on this, right? My own personal view is that whether or not that story was true, and I think the consensus is that it wasn't, the prospect certainly exists. But it's also equally likely I'll get COVID from an eye infection.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of things that are possible. There's also things that are not especially likely.
Yeah.
And so, I think you've got to look at that. But you do, in some ways, need to plan for state actors to do more.
Yeah.
And we know there is a track record of this in shall we say the Five Eyes countries. This is a time-honored tradition, and it wouldn't be terribly surprising if there was an attempt to turn the tables with other nations. So I think you ought to be prepared for it. I think, but you also got to realize there's certain things you can control and certain things you can't. So, if you're worried about, this is again personal view, if you're worried about the Dr. Strangelove scenarios, precious bodily fluids that are in the walls, our mother chips are infected and so forth, then maybe what you ought to do is ensure that you don't really have to terribly depend on the integrity of the server. You need to be looking at micro enclaves, or you need to be doing a better job monitoring so you can detect ingress and things like that. So,
Yeah.
I think these are all things on the board. But at a certain point, you also got to throw up your hands and say, like, how much diligence can you really do over your supply chain? You're not going to take an electron microscope and spend 2 years, capping chips and things like that. So.
Well, I think the first time I'm going to swear in this podcast is coming up now. I'm going to say COVID, because I think the current pandemic crisis, and with everyone working from home and increasing the wider threat environment, the number of endpoints and touch points that there are for people to get in through what are inherently insecure networks because they're home networks is enormous. I think that will, though, generate a revolution along the lines that you've been talking about, and people having to properly think about remote working and and expanding networks beyond what you can control in a building and through a single server. And we'll get some very interesting lessons out of what's going on. Are you picking up any trends or anything at the moment that are for the good or things for the bad?
I'm going to answer this. I'm going to answer this slightly a different way, which is that I think as you look at the way in which the workplace is changing, and I do think some of this COVID business is going to change the way that people approach work a bit differently. I think there will be a lot more flexibility around teleworking, for example, and probably a reduced physical footprint with many of the offices as a result. But it does change the model about how you think about, for example, anomaly detection, or looking for patterns of access that might indicate a problem. So, in places I've been before, you run a data science team and you're ingesting large volumes of data that you would consider surveillance in a governmental context, but is frankly just part of what you do if you work for a corporation.
Yeah.
You surveil your employees and you're looking at all that digital exhaust, and you're trying to paint a picture of whether their activity is appropriate or not. And you're mostly looking for bad things. It could be insider trading.
Yeah.
It could be administrative access that isn't what you expect. It could be developers accessing production. It could be looking for people that are potential flight risk. Some of those activities and patterns all go out the window when you have people in a teleworking environment. Some of your normal analytics. Well, this person is supposed to be in Los Angeles and their office is in New York. Why are they logging in from LA when we know they work in New York? Well,
Yeah.
analytic might have worked if they in fact do work in New York. If they're working from home, maybe all bets are off, and some of those analytics don't work the way you expect. So your baselining is getting thrown off by some of these, frankly, very different work patterns. So I think that's one area in which it's changed. I don't know if that's good or bad. It does mean that if we've had a previous dependence on behavioral baselining, then those baselines all get out of whack. The other thing I would say about this is it does in some ways purify the analytic space a little bit. We have at Complex, we like things that are deterministic. They're either true or they're false, right? We don't like shades of, we're happy with shades of gray, but some of the things we do around authentication, looking for credential forgery and things like that,
yep.
It's a state table, right?
Yeah.
You're either observing the protocol, you're not, right? And if you're not, then we know you're about to be taken over, from a above the fold breach standpoint, right? So we think that that essentially separating the wheat from the chaff, the good analytics versus the bad analytics, the ones that produce a lot of false positives versus the ones that don't, is a helpful thing. So, to be completely self-serving about it, it's kind of good for us because some of the things we do are highly deterministic, and we think that's better in an age where a lot of your noise has been sliding around your ability to detect. So.
Yeah,
makes sense.
The tech bit is fascinating. But are you seeing the threat landscape developing, changing? Where is it at the moment? And do you think the current crisis is going to force a change in the threat landscape?
I think it will make it muddier, right? So, like there's in terms of threats, most mature organizations are going to take different kinds of security incidents and put them in buckets, right? I'm talking about security incidents by insiders, people who work for them, right? And it's a Sev 1, Sev 2, Sev 3 kind of tiering, right? Where Sev 1 is the stuff that you report to the board, and Sev 3 is the stuff that you just kind of deal with, right?
Yeah.
And so somebody emailing a spreadsheet to their home Gmail account so they can work on it on the plane, that was something that wouldn't have attracted much attention other than maybe a slap on the wrist and a visit from your ER rep.
Yeah.
Nowadays, there needs to be more accommodations for some of the home working. So I think some of the constraints are loosened a little bit. That means that there's probably a bigger corpus of relatively low severity incidents that you're seeing, a larger number of that. And that makes it harder to find those real high severity incidents where there's fewer of them, but they're incredibly high impact. So I think it makes it a bit harder to separate what's really, really serious from the stuff that's frankly garden variety, small time violations that really you shouldn't worry that much about.
But traditionally, when we've talked about threat, there's always been this it's the big bad wolf. It's something that's out there. And when threats are talked about out to the general public, and they talk about protecting their data, and if you don't check your password, your bank account's going to be emptied, or your credit card's going to be stolen, and all the rest of it. And then you hear this huge data breach, and you go and check your bank account, you check your credit cards, and nothing seems to have happened. Do you think we've got to a point now where, from a society perspective, people are blasé about the actual threat that's there because we've been beating them with this big stick for so long? And if so, how do we change that? How do we get reality into it? Because the threat is there.
I think the threat is definitely there, although I have a slightly contrarian take on it, and I'm going to divide this into enterprise and public-private sphere, right? So in the enterprise space, I have a general rule of thumb, which is the more the chief security officer talks about the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese and the boogity-boogities, the more likely that they're actually neglecting a lot of their basics, their hygiene, their vulnerability management program, risk issue management, triage, basic metrics. Like, it's easy to say, look over there, Russians and defenseless babies, and harder to run a program that's founded on data and solid in principles. In the public-private space, I think if you're a private citizen, and all you hear about is how the Chinese are coming for your precious bodily fluids, then sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors. It
No,
should have
we
been the
get
Russians,
it.
right? Right. Sorry, I have a Dr. Strangelove on the mind today, on the brain today. But if that's all you're talking about, the Russians are coming to mess with our elections or this or that, it doesn't really help you change your habits day to day.
Yeah.
I mean, are you going to put something on the street corner that says "loose lips sink ships"
Yeah.
and go back to 1943?
Yeah.
I don't think so. So I think the big gap that I see, in terms of how we educate the public is what do you want people to do, practically speaking, that's different? My dear old dad, who's 83 now, 82, excuse me, sent out an email saying, your mother and I are thinking of a password manager, and what should we get? And
You're
like,
thinking, wow, you're thinking of a
yeah, right.
82. You're thinking password manager. Fantastic.
Yeah, I know, right? So it shows that the apple falls upwards, I guess, sometimes, as opposed to down off the tree. But so yeah, so I was pretty delighted to hear it. But it, like, to me, this is an example of, as a private citizen, taking a solid step to increase what your level of personal accountability and security. And I think that's ultimately where these things need to go. So is less talking about big boogity nation states, and more about, like, what should you actually be doing.
Yeah.
But look, it's also fair to say that, like, maybe people shouldn't be doing much, because there's enough liability shielding and things like that it almost doesn't matter if your identity gets stolen. Like, somebody's going to give you money and put you on an identity watch program, and, like, if you've purchased something with a credit card, you get the purchase back, and like, all that. So there is sort of a moral hazard side of this that is,
interestingly,
we made it easy for people not to care that much.
Yeah, interesting. In the UK, where it used to be that if someone nicked something out of your bank account because your credentials have been stolen, you automatically got it back. Now the banks are increasingly closing down and checking to see that someone hasn't deliberately, even from an accidental perspective, given their details away, and enabled the criminals to do it. And if they have done that, the banks are going, we're not necessarily refunding you. And then when we get into the enterprise side of things, the big bogeyman that sits over all of us is the European General Data Protection Regulation, which 4% of the global annual turnover is a big enough, or 20 million euros, whichever is the bigger, is a big enough threat for people to start to get that right. And I sit there with this little thing in my mind where Angela Merkel has decided that an American company has breached the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's a big, huge corporate, and she's just writing the letter to Donald Trump to say this is the fine, 4% of turnover, and we're trying to work out what the reply from Donald would be. But it's interesting. The threats are out there, and the penalties are huge.
Yeah. Yeah, GDPR is fascinating for a lot of reasons. I was tracking and pretty close to the Data Protection Directive, which immediately preceded GDPR, and so I was pretty familiar with how things were tracking. I'm actually been pretty involved with the program that we have as a vendor around how we're orienting our compliance program. I actually think GDPR is quite healthy, but so there's always been this transatlantic divide, right, where Americans are very rule focused and the Europeans are very principle focused, and I think that's quite healthy.
Well, and it changes between different European countries. The Germans will invent the rules, the French will ignore the rules, and the Brits will apply the rules, and that's just the way it goes.
Yes, we could probably do a European heaven, European hell joke fest.
We probably could do.
But yeah, so I find it our attitudes are very different, and of course the Germans have several legacies that they're wrestling with, including East German surveillance, and before that, of course, Hitler. So they're very sensitive to things in a way that the Brits are a little bit less so. They're a little closer to the Americans, and the Americans, of course, have this legacy of unfettered collection of everything, and combined with ceaseless marketing,
and that's
unending
free,
marketing.
That's free society.
Yeah, free enterprise and all that. So I think but what's been interesting about it is, I think everybody knows this, if you're a multinational, you are applying GDPR everywhere. You're not
Yeah.
because you don't really have the ability to differentiate between your EU data subjects and your American ones. So you're just going to treat them all the same. And of course, on this side of the pond, you've got the California
Yep.
Privacy Act as
Yep.
well, consumer privacy, which is doing some similar but slightly different things. And so, I think between the two of them, you've got it's really raised the watermark around how you treat personal data. I think that's massively helpful.
Yep.
Because you're not treating this stuff like just stuff you have. You're actually trying to take care of it. And I think being a good custodian of our customers' data is probably the most important thing that we can all aspire to. So I think it's been wonderful in that respect.
Yeah, well, I think it was described to me by Dean Armstrong QC, one of our leading lawyers or barristers in dealing with data protection here, as the sea change is, instead of whenever you've given the data to a company, they think they own that data. They now realize that they're just borrowing that data to do it in the way that you've given them permissions to do it. And if they don't do that, they can get slapped. But it's interesting. You talk about the financial market and all the rest of it. And I mentioned Dean, and I showed you this book beforehand, which is called Blockchain and Cryptocurrency: International Legal and Regulatory Challenges. And one of the challenges that there was in that is he brings out the fact that if you have a public key blockchain system that's there, it can be non-GDPR compliant at any time, because your personal identifiable data is never immutable, is one of the issues that's in there. But I went to the British regulators, because if you're in a regulated industry then, as the financial industry is, and I went to our Financial Conduct Authority and said, this textbook has just been published, what are you going to do about it? And they went away and went, okay, we take our lead from the Information Commissioner's Office. So I went to the Information Commissioner's Office, and this was last year, and said, this textbook's just been published. It's going to have an impact on the regulated industry. The regulated industry say, you set the rules. What are you going to do about it? And they said, we're setting up a commission to look at the impact of technology and the current regulations. And I said, yeah, but the regulation is live today, and you haven't got a ruling on it. So what are you going to do about it? We're setting up a commission to, and I was thinking, there's, because a lot of this is so new, the rules aren't out there, but the law's there. So that means my QC friend is sitting there in his barrister's chambers in London, rubbing his hands in glee, going, potential for a lot of money to be made here. But it's a threat, it's a risk. And QOMPLX produce insurance for these sorts of risks. Is that risk not too big for you to start to look at?
Well, that's a fairly hard question to answer. I will say, when you look at GDPR violations on the order of 4% of turnover, that's significant. I'm not sure we're signed up to provide insurance on that scale.
Yeah.
But the broader question of what do you do with some of these new technologies? Do you fully understand the impacts? How does it ripple through the regulatory environment in such a way that firms can have clarity? And ultimately, that's what you want if you're a corporation. You want some clarity around what you need to do. Companies will do what they're asked. They just need to know what it is, right? And I would say this is true with the regulators I've worked with on this side of the pond and have some vantage to on the other side of the pond, is there's always been a natural conflict and tension between the consumer-facing side of it, which is where this GDPR, some of the GDPR oriented concerns are coming from, and the institutional regulatory side, which and they've never really been fully reconciled. So I think just the fact that you've got some of these things getting smacked together has some implications. I will tell you that the way that most companies, at least the ones that I have visibility into, have been dealing with it is we tend to be fairly leery of fads just because they're there. I think the conclusion that was reached in one place I've previously been employed was stay clear of public blockchain. Because there are lots of things that can be implied or inferred because it is immutable, and it would be best if the institution didn't have its fingerprints on a public blockchain. And so private blockchain has really been the focus, and I think that will continue, or semi-public but controlled access kinds of places. And I think that's actually the right attitude. I think if you're a consumer and you're contributing to something blockchain oriented, I think that's a slightly different concern. But corporations, I think, tend to be rightly leery of putting themselves in a position where they have to bear more risk. And I think in the particular case you raised here, that's going to probably pay off. And so you're not going to see a lot of exposure to risk, even if, public blockchain is ruled as on its face being publicly identifiable, which I might argue, but I can see the logic in it.
Yeah, and this is where when things start to get argued out in court and the rule books have been written by lawyers, it's a good way of them printing money for themselves in many cases. And that's the difficulty with it, and a lot of it is going to come down to case law. But it's also an example, I think, of where technology has been rushed out so quickly. And then it's the rules for a rules-based society is trying to play catch-up with it. Do you think we'll ever get to a point where that's not going to happen? We just have to accept that that's a fact of life. And how, from an organisation that is trying to de-risk that, do you put that into what it is that you're doing?
I think about it the following way, right? In any organization, you have a whole series of risks that you're trying to address. If you look at the sort of superset of them, you could sort of look at them as operational risks, and those break down into things like compliance and human error and cyber and money laundering and so forth. I am friendly with the folks at the Operational Risk Exchange that do a nice job trying to sketch out the landscape of what these operational risks are like, right? But if you look at that landscape, if you're a corporation, what you're trying to do is to say the risk is this big vaporous cloud. It eludes easy capture and grasp, right? It kind of slips through your fingers a little bit. So what you try to do is you try to have control frameworks and structures that enable you to put processes around controlling as much of that risk as you currently understand and have appetite to address. Right? And then within that, you start to enumerate, flesh out, and ultimately measure and monitor the effectiveness of those controls on the of the risks you have appetite to address and you understand, right? But as technology changes, that vaporous cloud continues to expand into the previously unknown vacuum, and that means you've got to expand your control structure to address it. And so you're never going to fully address all of it in the sense that a cloud is incredibly hard to contain, but you can try to squeeze your control structure to get to touch more and more of it so that you feel better over time. And I think what that means is you have to be comfortable with knowing that there's a universe of risk that you're never going to fully get your arms around, but you've made an honest job at it and you've tried to address as much as you can. And there's an open dialogue, I think, with the regulators and with governmental agencies to try and figure out what the right balance is. And those opinions will never quite be the same. Because most corporations would prefer to be completely unregulated, and most governments would prefer to maximally regulate the risk-bearing industry sectors that they can. Banking being one of them. So,
but do you find with QOMPLX that one of the important things that you put out is a de-risking advice as much as providing that paid for service with insurance and elsewhere?
We do, yeah. So, as I look at this as an old consultant, right? When you look at items that we find in an assessment or in a product we deploy, you break it down into amount of risk and difficulty of fixing, right? And things that are, if we go in and do a consulting job and we surveil your perimeter, we look at your infrastructure, we instrument some of your key controls, and we develop an opinion on it, we're going to come back and say, these are your quick wins, right? What should you be addressing right now that captures a large amount of risk that can be done with little effort? What are your strategic projects, stuff you got to work at to do? What are your discretionary fixes? And then what can you safely bear and not worry about? And we try to put things into one of those 4 boxes so that clients can make an informed decision about what to do. And we do that partly because we don't want to back the bus up with consultants and keep permanent residents inside the 4 walls of their company. Not that you could do that these days anyway, because everybody's virtual, but also because, frankly, clients want to make decisions. Especially if you're a manager or a senior manager, you actually don't want this stuff to fester. You want to take care of it. And so getting some expert advice and opinion on what you ought to be doing and frankly, where you shouldn't be doing anything at all is sometimes some of the best advice we can try to give. So we aspire to that. And I think we often hit the mark, and clients will tell us when we don't. So.
a very difficult one, given the current circumstances. But where do you see things developing over the next sort of 3 to 5 years? If you can answer that.
Hard to tell. I would say, probably again, I'm going to speak from the corporate context a little bit.
Yeah.
If you look at where most companies are going, they're hollowing out their infrastructures,
Mm-hmm.
right? The old data center model where you build a data center, you'd fill it with all sorts of stuff, is being replaced by the cloud. Ironically enough, the banks are late to this. It's a lot of the digital natives, the born in the cloud companies, like frankly Complex.
Yeah.
We have basically zero infrastructure ourselves. We are using other people, whether it's AWS or whatever, for most of our applications and virtual private networks and VPCs and things like that. So, but if you're an older corporation, you're trying to move to this new model. I don't want to say older corporation, but if you've got a more traditional infrastructure and application environment, then you're on a journey right now. And I think everybody's grappling with that transition. The thing that is, so I think there's, two problems here. The first is, how do you deal with infrastructure that's ephemeral?
Yep.
How do you have a sense of control over what you're doing? We have some theories about this and things that we're trying to put into practice. And as the CISO, that's part of my job, right, is to make sure we do that well. The other side of it is, it's not just a lift and shift. You don't just say, move to the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And pick up the forklift, move the servers, and drop the applications in a new environment. That's your mess for less model.
Yeah.
Which is not what companies really want. What they really want is they're doing it to retool. They want to be more agile. They want to modernize their processes. They want to be more responsive to consumers, be able to move faster. That's why you have chief digital officers and digital transformation initiatives that are meant to, quote, digitize businesses, right?
Yeah.
Move them. And that means overhauling how you build apps, your entire process of how you build them, how you promote them, how you do change control, how you remove humans out of production, things like that. That's hugely expensive. And I think from an overall risk standpoint, this is hugely changing how companies come to market. And there's a lot of places where risk can be introduced. So this is, these two things, both the move to the cloud generally, how you deal with the cloud as a thing and how you secure the stuff in it.
Yeah.
And the transformation along the way. These are probably the two dominant themes right now. I think you touched on one of the other ones, Philip, which is the massive profusion of devices and implied the increasing embrace of consumer gear as part of the corporate security perimeter. So that's, I think, the other thing that we're all trying to get our arms around.
It is, I continue to hear the debate. The Huawei debate annoys me because people talk about hardware. If I want to break into devices, I'm not going to waste money in trying to hardwire stuff into hardware. I'll put it in an app. One of the best threat apps I've seen in recent years was Pokemon Go. I did a little blog on that, but I found it quite interesting because I read the terms and conditions. I'm one of these sad people that every now and again goes in and reads the terms and conditions as to where the data was being held and what you give it gave you access to. And it was something that was developed by a shell company that was funded through CIA funding. It had for the National Geographic Intelligence Center. It had given access to all of the data on the facility, all the Google data that was on there, including all the photographs, address books, emails, and everything else. And you had to give permissions for that when you first went into it. It allowed you to geolocate your position and take a picture of a monster against something, and they put high price monsters in there. If I, and being an ex-intelligence officer, if I wanted to put an intelligence operation into say Moscow to take the photograph of a top secret door entrance into one of the intelligence facilities. To put a team on the ground to do that would take months and months and months of planning. You'd probably last on the ground about 35 seconds. You might actually get shot. But if I got a 12-year-old son or daughter of the senior person that's working in there on daddy's phone playing Pokemon Go and goes click, and you get that all over the world. It may or may not be true. I'm not casting any aspersions whatsoever to the developers of Pokemon Go, but it raised my eyebrows. And I look at the terms and conditions. I was talking about the increased security with Zoom, and we're on Zoom at the moment on British Radio this morning, and it's because our Prime Minister held his first virtual cabinet meeting yesterday. He did it over Zoom. Someone took a photograph of the screen and put it out under the Zoom meeting ID at the top of it. and there's the talk of people sort of hacking into Zoom, and I turned around and I put the question out there. Well, there's 3 different types of communication on Zoom that's here that could all be recorded in different places. There's what we're speaking on, which is supposed to be end-to-end encrypted. But then we've got the chat facility. Well, that's going to be stored somewhere because they can give me my chat history. So where's the server for that? And is it the same server? It might not be. And then I'm recording the whole thing. So that could be sitting somewhere. And does that have the same sort of end-to-end encryption on it? Probably not. And where is that sitting? And people don't sit and ask these questions as they're going through things. And that's where it's understanding your digital vulnerabilities and your digital exposure that's out there is an interesting thing.
I think it's well said, and Zoom's is a company that has an interesting history, and they've been going for market share and so forth, and the Pokemon, stuff.
I wish I'd bought shares in Zoom before this happened.
Yeah,
because they'll be rocketing.
Yeah, it's been great time to be Zoom. That's for sure. Great time
definitely.
to be a video conferencing company in general.
Definitely.
Yeah. But I always love Mark. I quote this a lot actually because it's one of my favorite quotes. But Marcus Renham, whom I'm sure you know of, once said, "The internet will continue to be as insecure as it possibly can be while still continuing to function." And I think there's, he's a bit of a cynic, and I suppose I am, having been in the space 20 years, but I think there's something fundamentally true about that. There's nothing that new about a lot of this, but they're just new wrinkles on it. And I think we'll continue to see continued exposure in the consumer space and with consequences that may only be known in hindsight. But the more irresistible and free something is, the more suspicious we, as security people, we ought to be.
Well, exactly. And I think on that note, and the fact that your 80-something-year-old parents are talking about password managers and cybersecurity, the message is actually getting out there. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. It's been fascinating.
Indeed, Philip. Thank you for having me.